Okay, wait a minute. Oh, we got to adjust this window a bit here. So we are live now. All right, so I am here today with Pseudo-Celsus on Twitter, and he is a neo-reactionary with a blog called Untimely. Oh, what was it again? Untimely Sense. Now, in reading his blog, and some of his posts, kind of realized that I was actually a little bit familiar with some of this new right stuff, neo-reaction stuff. Anyway, kind of accidentally, just through osmosis of reading stuff, watching videos, and talking to people on Twitter. But this is a great opportunity, I think, for myself and for the audience. I think to really get a fuller grasp of what the new right represents, what neo-reaction is, and what they believe, and maybe we'll have some things to argue about, some things to agree on, some or just a learning experience in general. I'm assuming. So let's start with asking, how did you come to this position of neo-reaction? What was your kind of political journey?
Oh gosh, you're starting with the hard balls today. I'd like to first start off by extending my friendly greetings to you and your channel. We're gonna make the Red Brown Alliance a reality to hopefully today by the end of the stream here. Anyway, yeah, I mean my political journey. I mean, gosh. That I mean, I think everyone today kind of more or less has a similar sort of story. Although I mean, I don't know. So it's 2024. There might be a very broad kind of age range of people listening to this. I think though that if you're a sensitive young person, if you're kind of intellectually inclined young person. Sorry if the landscaping in the background is kind of the gods have given us terrible timing
That's all right.
with respect to that. But yeah, no. When I think that when you're a sensitive kind of young intellectual person, and you come up in today's world, especially kind of in the 21st century, you know you eventually realize like something's kind of not right. Like yeah, especially young people, you don't want to like go through life being some sort of crank, right? Some sort of like radical, paranoiac, political person, who's always trying to like dissect the way the media is kind of lying to us, right? No, you want to just go to prom, you want to go to college, you want to do what the adults tell you, that things that the check boxes you need to do just to have kind of like a normal life, but eventually you realize that like something's rotten, right? Something's not working right, or at least things just kind of aren't working the way that we were sort of promised, right? And then so when you're in that situation, you have kind of two choices. You can either take up the red flag of revolution, which I take it many on your channel they're sympathetic to that kind of line, or you can go with the white flag of reaction. Those are your kind of two choices. And then sometimes the centrists, the libs, they say there's a kind of like horseshoe theory, right? With respect to these kind of out there, these kind of fringe politics, that it's easy to oscillate between sort of kind of one or the other. There's many examples throughout history, right, of people either starting out reactionary and then going to kind of like a more revolutionary kind of leftist position, or going the other way, right? Mussolini comes to mind, right? His parents, I think they actually owned like a socialist newspaper, one of the earlier ones in Italy, and he was a socialist himself, or a Marxian even, before going to found his regime over there. Um, Personally, I would say, when I kind of started to sort of become more politically radical, which would have been sort of like around the time I think of. I'm sure everyone remembers kind of 2008. This era, I think, is sort of deeply burned into the memory of particularly kind of like millennials, especially millennials in this kind of radical politics sphere or whatever, or I'll say quote unquote radical. Um, but yeah. 2008 going into 2011, Occupy 2012. Um, there's a deep sense of kind of like discontent that I don't think has really abated. It's metamorphed. That's not a word, right? It's evolved over time from then, but more or less, kind of, so all the usual things that go along with that. With respect to whether I would characterize myself as a person of the left or the right at that time, I would, and I'm trying to wrap a bow around this really quick so we can move on. I would say that I would have characterized myself as a quote unquote radical centrist, not in the sense that I was like an extremist, like centrist, but in kind of like the opposite sense of that term. That like as long as something was kind of anti-establishment, I would be showing up to that party. Anything that we could use, right, to kind of fix these problems we have, these like underlying kind of systemic problems that are screwing the planet up, screwing our people over. I would be okay with that, right? Whether it's Ron Paul, whether it was Bernie Sanders, whatever, or then even later, right? Like just kind of any movement generally with an anti-establishment bent. I had some kind of keen interest in that. I would want to see how that played out. And then so as a younger person, that's basically kind of where my politics were. And then over the last decade, I would say is when I wound up finding myself kind of firmly on the right. And there's maybe multiple. It's difficult to point to kind of like one reason why that shift would have happened. This isn't gonna endear me, I think, to a lot of my friends in like the kind of Twitter right space. Everyone wants to pretend that they like popped out of the womb being like this like based giga chad that like never had any sympathies with anything remotely leftist or whatever. But I mean, the reality is what it is. But anyway, yeah, to tie it kind of back into how we met. We met because I saw a tweet of yours. You said something along the lines of, or I actually have it right here. I'll quote it verbatim. Today I learned right wing is when you don't think people who almost certainly went through, a particular biological process should get to punch women in the face, right? And like I remember like going through kind of like several struggles with topics like this on my own, right? With this like kind of like new left that's like emerged recently, which we can talk about. That's like what people talk about, like wokeness or whatever. But like eventually, I just learned to stop worrying and accept the fact that, yeah, that just is right wing. And I don't know. So I kind of put a lot out there. Maybe not as much as the time I spent on that would have indicated or suggested. But anyway, yeah. Sorry, I'm sorry if I'm being a little bit prolix, being a little bit of a word cell right now. I'm just getting into gear here. But does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, no, that helps. So let's just talk a bit about the main article that you wrote called, I think it's called Why Neoreaction. Where is it? I have it right here. No, yeah, Neoreaction, Why and How. It's on your blog, Untimely Sense. And I figure it's kind of your introductory main kind of statement on your politics and your philosophy. So that was the one I focused on. And I'll just give a little critique up front on the article. I think you did a pretty good job outlining the philosophy, the beliefs, the politics, and you gave a few examples as well. Overall, I did like if I were your professor, I'd probably give you like a maybe a B plus. Some of the it was a bit edgy, a bit edgelordy, and that was some of that was a bit cringy. But the bulk of the information was good. You kind of presented it in a way that was a little a little too edgy for me. But yeah, overall, I thought it did a good job. But so get me. I'm going to try to given your article and given the other things I've kind of seen on the internet, I'm going to try to give a definition of neo-reaction, and then you tell me whether that makes works for you. So
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
so all right, what I got from your article and just in general was that neo-reaction is a right-wing synthesis between modern technology and quote classical principles of government, which combine to establish order and resist disorder. And order is generally that which enhances and sustains life, which is therefore good, or you see that as the good. Uh, does that sum it up?
Yeah. So, in this particular piece, I wanted to try and define neo-reaction in kind of more of a positive sense, right? And so, yeah. I think that's a kind of good general understanding of what neo-reactionaries kind of believe. Um, so we can define neo-reaction by kind of splitting it into the stems, right? It's right there in the word. There's neo and then reaction. You could think this is kind of like a paradox, right? It's like neo-reaction. It's kind of like it's almost like it sounds like an oxymoron, right? But basically, what neo-reactionaries are trying to get at is that it's not necessarily that reaction is something that we're saying, oh, it's just good in itself because it's older, right? Or a progressive might say, oh, well, if something's just new, if it's like the bleeding edge of like what's the most leftist thing anyone's doing, that's necessarily better than any other position you could have because that's more outmoded, right? That's not what we're saying as neo-reactionaries. We tend to have a fondness for the past, right? We tend to emphasize lots of things. We definitely tend to emphasize that what people think of as modern progress is bad. It's we're in a state of decline, not ascent. This kind of stuff. But yeah. So insofar as we're neo-reactionaries, we're not going to have just like kind of like a knee-jerk rejection of everything that's modern. Right? If there's something that's modern, that's good, that's healthy, that works out, we like that. And so, yeah, I think you did a good job summarizing what I was saying there. We're trying to combine sort of the best of modern technology, modern social techniques with the best of classical thought. And then so where modernity tends to kind of be stronger is in terms of the Enlightenment, in terms of technoscience, right? All these incredible technologies we have, all these incredible techniques of engineering that are allowing us to have this conversation, even, right? Just to name one example. But as neo-reactionaries, we tend to think that modernity, it's a little bit weaker on the moral and political side. Although, so our modern technology, it's clearly superior to ancient technology. As neo-reactionaries, we tend to, when we look back at someone like Aristotle or, even more recent, like Frederick II or Clausewitz or something, we see much more edifying, much kind of clearer thinking about political philosophy, this kind of stuff, than we get out of today's progressives, out of today's liberal thinking. And then insofar as
why is classical political thought better than modern?
That's a yeah. So there's two ways we could take that question. One is to say, why is it better in terms of just simply like evaluating why classical political thought is better than modern in terms of, why is this one good and why is this one bad. The other way to go at it would be to discuss why is it that in the modern age we've come to adopt such horrible ideas. Um, I'll give a brief answer in the first sense before kind of trying to give a quick and dirty answer with respect to, kind of like how did we get here? How did we stray so far from the light? So I'm gonna try and stick to the principle of KISS throughout the course of this because I think a lot of times, especially with Neoreaction, it's easy to get lost in the complexities, the details. KISS, of course, standing for Keep It Simple, Stupid. So to me, where modern thought, and this is a philosophically sophisticated channel, so of course everyone knows that modernity. You just had a pretty decent video on Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now, where you go over a lot of this, right? So modernity, it's more or less kind of, you can consider it to be kind of synonymous with the Enlightenment. Maybe you say it starts a little bit earlier at the Renaissance or the Protestant Reformation. But basically, at some point in Europe specifically, there was a clean break between this sort of pre-modern world and the modern world, right? If you want to focus on philosophers, people say this happened sometime around Descartes. You could also look at Francis Bacon, right? The inventor of the scientific method. And the main philosophical text where Bacon invents this scientific method is the New Organon. And in the New Organon, he's specifically challenging Aristotle, right? It's in the name, like Organon, right? That's a reference to Aristotle's kind of outlook on the world. And while Bacon, it's commendable what he was doing, and it developed an extremely powerful kind of pragmatic way of looking at the world, this notion that knowledge is power to affect change, right? You can't say that it hasn't produced incredible results. It has done that, but in shifting our focus to this like extremely pragmatic orientation, we've kind of lost sight of what I think intuitively should be a very kind of common sense way of viewing the world, which would be this more ancient kind of virtue ethical framework. And we're not going to get into philosophy 101 here, but in the ancient world, it was more, I think, common for people to just kind of understand that there were inherent teleologies, or by inherent telos. Telos is a Greek word that means purpose. And so for the ancient mindset, purpose is just something that's in the thing, right? If I have like a hammer, it's just obvious to the ancient person that the purpose of the hammer is doing carpentry. It's driving nails into stuff. Or, the purpose of your feet is that it's to walk. But to a modern mindset, we're taught all these things that, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, that, there's no such thing as kind of inherent purpose. We create our own values, our own purposes. So, yeah, sure, you can use your feet for walking, but you can also use your feet to start like a OnlyFans and make a lot of money, doing like weird stuff with your feet, right? And those are both just as good as one another. But the ancient view is that, no, there are kind of like proper purposes that things have. And we can understand this in kind of more of like a common sense It's a kind of common sense philosophy ultimately. Although I don't necessarily like using that word because the word common sense, because we've strayed so far from it today. It's difficult to it's difficult to say that common sense is common in that respect. But so yeah, so why is ancient political thought better than modern? I think that in getting away from the notion of natural law, that things by nature have certain purposes and that it's good for them to just kind of flourish and to actualize those purposes. We get it. We've gone off the wrong track, and we've become confused. We've become confused, and we've become alienated in many sort of respects. When you look at a lot of these kind of Marxian critiques of alienation, I think what we're really kind of looking at is like the respect in which, because everything in our modern technical society has to be oriented around expanding mammon, expanding, flows of capital. It's no longer the case that, we're using money to exchange goods. We're creating goods so that we can exchange money. There's like a teleological inversion in play with that, right? Like think about like the fidget spinner. The fidget spinner is it's purposeless, right? And like toys are fun or whatever. But I think it's symbolic. It's indicative of this kind of alienated modern kind of society we have. And so yeah, so I don't know. Does that make sense? Do I need to tie a bow around any of that?
So yes, please tie a bow because
Yeah,
so
sorry.
so
I went on a few tributaries there.
mhm.
But yeah, so basically, all right. Let's just do a kind of short version of this then. The reason that classical political thought is better than modern, when the Enlightenment began, it was a very brave experiment in human relations. It was this idea. There was this idea that we would be able to just start from nothing and use our own reason to come up with better conditions for society, for politics, for human life, right? And future generations would benefit from this experiment in the use of human reason to intervene into social and political affairs. And so you see the liberal revolutions of the 18th and 19th century that come out of
Mm.
this, right? Not just the American one, but also the French. And then later, there were other movements, right, that throw their hats into the ring as these kind of like champions of this kind of enlightenment revolutionizing of human affairs, in particular the Marxist one. And then in the 20th century, what we saw was a kind of confrontation between two competing enlightenment visions of how to revolutionize social and political affairs for like the betterment of the future or whatever, right? And so the neo-reactionary perspective, I think, is that we've come to a point where this notion of progress itself has to be called into question because of the kind of collapse and the failures of these various attempts that have been made from beginning from kind of modern political premises, right? Like we've got to dare to use our reason to transform the world or what have you. What neo-reactionaries are doing is we're calling into question the notion that we should even be reinventing the wheel at all necessarily, right? It turns out that there actually is such a thing as human nature. It seems to be what we're kind of finding out, right, through this process of kind of playing havoc with the entire world, now with the entire planet, right, in the 21st century. We've been playing havoc with this stuff for a few centuries. And what the neo-reactionaries humbly suggest is that we've been finding out that that's a mistake. And maybe it's just not necessarily so good to reinvent the wheel on that stuff. And that, maybe there's just, we just haven't learned anything about morals fundamentally that Aristotle didn't already know.
Okay, that sets it up a bit better. So I'll pick up on a couple things you said there. You mentioned one thing. You mentioned the phrase liberal revolutions, and I think that's a perfect phrase for getting at maybe what our main disagreement's going to be. And as a Marxist, you could probably guess that really our critique is going to be that this ideology, and most kind of tendencies on the right and left actually, are ultimately idealist, because the way I would talk about it was these were bourgeois revolutions, not so much liberal revolutions. And the difference there is that liberal is kind of the ideology of the bourgeois, and the bourgeoisie was this class of people that emerged out of the decay and the collapse of the feudal system, and that it was the material conditions, the class itself that emerged and its preeminence that produced the liberal revolution, kind of not the other way around. That it was not these ideas that suddenly changed the world. It was the emergence of a new type of society based on different relations of production that kind of demanded its own new ways of looking at the world. And you also mentioned kind of that reinventing the wheel was a mistake. And I think you're referring there to the liberal revolutions and I suppose the socialist revolutions as well. Of course, we disagree with that. We'd see them all as progress or attempts at progress in the sense of bringing humans closer to more complete freedom and developing the productive forces to a higher degree, which we'll talk about later. And that, mistakes, right? And so I think my position would be that you can't really think of them as mistakes because as if these were kind of entirely consciously reasoned things that happened because somebody decided, rather than expressions of the contradictions of capitalist society, and before that, expressions of the decay and the contradictions of the feudal order. Before that, it wasn't kind of this kind of utopian set of beliefs where people just said, we should make the society this way now, let's try it out. No, it's the material organization of society and its contradictions that pushed that made these things necessary, or made them become necessities. You can pick up on that, or I would actually like to ask you a kind of more general question, in that, could you describe broadly what kind of world you would like to live in? What does it look like? How is it different than now? Is it monarchism? Is it a type of fascism? What does it look like?
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting question, right? And this is necessarily kind of like a sort of philosophical, right, kind of leap that you're always making when you seek to just kind of like forget the way things are now, try to imagine, what kind of like world you would want to live in. So as a neo-reactionary, um, sorry, I don't mean to say so much. I'm channeling Lord Yarvin there a little bit. Yeah. So as neo-reactionaries, one of the kind of fundamental things. So I'm not going to go full brown shirt here. I'm not going to say we need to go trawling through the 20th century for some kind of solution here. The kind of world we want to live in, right? So we're not allergic to monarchism, right? That's no secret. At the same time, though, so like one of the fundamental, I think, kind of insights of neo reaction is that trying to prescribe the same world that everyone on the planet needs to live in is fundamentally a mistake. The kind of larger the system you're trying to build, the more unstable it's going to get, and the worse things are going to be when it inevitably kind of melts down. Um, that's a very kind of general point. But so one of the things that neo reactionaries, one of the key values we have is that order is good, right? We'll tie it back into that. Order is good. We, of course, freedom is also good. Okay, so I don't want to. I think there's been like a lot of confusion. People get lost in the sauce, yelling at each other on the internet all the time, and you've got these two camps, and one of them's like, well, when we get what we want, you're all going to go to the gulag, and then the other people, they get it. They incite each other, right? And then the other people are like, well, when we get what we want, you're all gonna be riding helicopters, right? And it's all this like stupid stuff. But as neo-reactionaries, we do see freedom as important. But a paradox emerges because of sort of a few things. One of which is we've been trained, I think, by our society to associate freedom with democracy. And one of the things that, as neo reactionaries, we understand is that those two things actually don't necessarily go together. You need a few things in place before you can have freedom. You can't enjoy freedom if you're living in this like anarchic Mad Max situation and you're always having to fight for your survival. Like, that's not freedom, right? Freedom is predicated on order. Order has to be there first. And so in order for there to be order, though, order is necessarily local. There's a quote from the Norbert Wiener, who's one of kind of the founding fathers of general systems theory. He says that chaos is global and order is local. So order is good, but order is necessarily, something that takes place in a certain pocket. The reason for this has to do with kind of thermodynamics, right? Everyone knows the second law of thermodynamics. We're all scientifically sophisticated socialists here, right? So the second law of thermodynamics says that entropy always increases, right? The only way you can decrease entropy is to increase it like somewhere else. So you can decrease the entropy in your room, but then you're spending calories doing that. You're exhaling carbon dioxide, right? There's like other stuff that in the world where entropy is increasing so that you can increase that order locally in your room. I think that, so just to kind of tie it back really quick to the question after all those preliminaries, the kind of world I want to see is one where, I'm not hoping that the United States collapses, but rather, I think it would just be healthy if we kind of if the United States were to step back, right, a little bit and kind of take its foot off of everyone else in the world. I think one of the things that we've learned from the early 21st century is that like trying to turn everyone into a carbon copy of like the United States liberal democratic political system doesn't work. It doesn't work for a lot of reasons, and some of those, are very hard for people to admit because they feel very fondly about the political system we have. But for various reasons, it's not necessarily the best for everybody. There's no one size fits all thing for everybody, and so the kind of world I think I would want to live in the future is one where people are free to kind of work out their own destiny, and that's not necessarily going to look the same everywhere, right?
That
But
sounds
I,
like
like
that
that's
sounds like
okay.
Marxism.
Does it?
It does, to me anyway.
Well,
To a
okay,
classical Marxist.
I mean, maybe it could, but I think so. Uh, the part where it gets not so Marxist is well, we can get to that later, right? But I just gave a nice, concise, simple explanation of what it looks like. I don't want to
Sure,
ruin it
yeah.
by making things more complicated.
Yeah. So so one of the things you said was that you think the U.S. needs to step back from its role as a global hegemon, I guess, or the world superpower, kind of the police of the world. I would. I mean, ultimately, that would. I mean, it's kind of the ultimate goal is to not have a capitalist superpower dominating the rest of the world. But let's say so long as you believe capitalism should stick around, and I'm not sure if you do. Actually, maybe you can clarify this. Um, to me as a Marxist, it seems inevitable that the U.S. is actually in its role as the global hegemon is the greatest force for order out of everything, right? Like, despite the fact that this battle in Ukraine is happening, Israel, all these other problems that the U.S. causes, which it certainly does, and it does create a degree of disorder because of it. Overall, since the Second World War, I mean the without the U.S. as the global superpower, I think if Trump got elected and decided to just pull back from everything, pull all the bases out, pull all our forces out everywhere, not ours, but the American forces, and stop meddling in economic influence everywhere in the world, the sanction regimes, etc. That would all that would do, in my estimation, would open up. Sure, it would open up some freedom for some of these countries, but what it would really do is open up conflict. Turkey, India, Pakistan. You would see a level of disorder, I think, not seen since both of the world wars. I think you could easily argue that it's the U.S. And I think the world wants. I think these countries actually like having the U.S. in its role right now, despite being angry at it every once in a while about certain ways it goes. But they don't want to take up this responsibility, and I think they know there is this responsibility needed. China, even Russia, like they all, I think, kind of at the end of the day, they don't want to take up this role, but they also acknowledge that it's needed. And I think it would create far more chaos if we were to assume that capitalism stays.
Yeah. So one thing I want to clarify really quick is that like power is not bad in itself. It's not necessarily always good either. But it just depends on like the way you use it, right? If you have a kitchen knife, you can use that for all kinds of useful stuff. You can use that to chop up your garlic and your onions or make your hamburgers or whatever, and that's all great. Or you can like misuse it, right, and do something bad, right? So power is not necessarily good or bad in itself, but I think that where the U.S. I think goes wrong necessarily is not so much that it has all this power, right? Just like sometimes you just get locked in to an expansionary phase in your society. And I don't think that if something like that happens, there's necessarily anything anyone can do to like stop that. Like, I don't think that there's like, if you go back and you look at ancient Rome, for example, like in the Republic, like right before kind of Caesar came to power, and then the imperial system right took over. I don't know that there's necessarily anything anyone could have done to like arrest that development, right? To kind of stop that. But where I think it would be healthy for the U.S. to kind of step back a little bit, I don't necessarily think that they need to completely right abandon all influence or whatever. But the issue that we have is that the U.S. as an imperial power, it's extremely ideological. If you look at kind of classical, traditional imperial powers, like we'll go back to like the first big empire, right, which is Persia. Persia, in spite of being like a very big empire, was actually like pretty good to live under. Even if you were kind of a subject, yeah, sure, you had to pay taxes. Yeah, sure, if they wanted to go invade somebody, you might have to levy some troops. But other than that, when the Persians conquered somebody, they allowed them to retain their customs, their laws. They allowed them to just simply like continue life as they were, except it's just you gotta pay some taxes. You're living under this empire, but there wasn't this like incessant need to constantly be like socially engineering like everyone that the Persians conquered. Like when the Persians conquered you, they didn't send a bunch of NGO employees to start teaching you about modern art and gay marriage and like all this stuff that like you'd never heard of before, right? And if you don't like completely like transform your society from the bottom up, you're violating universal human rights or whatever, right? But with the U.S., we don't necessarily treat our empire kind of like that. I mean, we do and we don't. But insofar as we kind of do that, there's a kind of schizophrenic kind of split consciousness we have as an imperial power. And so you say that the last point I'll respond to is you said the U.S. is actually a kind of source for order globally. If it was to recede back, there would be a little more disorder. And there's a little bit, I think, of truth to that. And we're kind of already seeing this. Like, as the power of the U.S. is weakening, which has been happening for a little while, we are starting to see, right, kind of some of this, like, more kind of classical forms of planetary disorder reemerging. Like, we're seeing China making moves in the South Pacific or the South China Sea, right? We're seeing, not just Ukraine, but, Venezuela tried to annex like half of Guyana or whatever, right? I mean, they haven't rolled in the tanks over there yet, last time I checked. But, stuff like that is going on. But from the neo-reactionary perspective, so now is a good time to start talking about sovereignty, right? In order for you to have order in your, wherever you live in your country, there has to be someone who's sovereign. If you don't have someone who's undisputably sovereign, you don't live in a country, you have a civil war. Whether that civil war is like kinetic or whether it's more passive aggressive and everyone is just making up laws off the top of their head and suing each other for $1 billion when they feel like it. Like, it's like when you don't have a sovereign, you have civil war. And what it means to have a sovereign is that, like, the sovereign is like the final authority. There's no authority above the sovereign, and sometimes sovereign powers are going to disagree about stuff. Okay, they have a little bit of a war every once in a while as a treat. But before the modern era, before mass democracy and mass politics, when we had kind of more of like a classical approach to politics, yes, there were still wars, but wars were a means to an end of like adjudicating a political difference. So in like an ideal neo-reactionary world, we'll take Russia and Ukraine for example, right? Russia and Ukraine should not have been this like insane existential battle to the death where like the entire population of like one or the other has to be destroyed before the conflict is like adjudicated. Like what we have is a diplomatic dispute over these regions, over what's going on in them. And I don't want to get into that because I don't have a dog in that race one way or the other. But in a kind of before the era of mass politics, of mass democracy, you would have had two sides that had, you know, particular claims. They can't sort it out diplomatically. They have a few battles. One of them loses. And then they come back to the table, right? They come back to the table. They say, okay, that's enough bloodshed. We'll just take the L. Okay? And then that's life. And then you move on. But what you get when you have these conditions of... so I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Okay, so one of the things that neo-reactionaries believe that's a little bit counterintuitive is that mass democracy and totalitarianism are synonymous. Mass democracy kind of evolves in the 20th century, and if you kind of look at the 20th century, you saw the emergence of three sort of systems. You had Stalin in the USSR. You had the Austrian painterman, and you know, in Germany, and then in the United States, you had Franklin Delano Roosevelt. All of these were totalitarian systems in a kind of generally equivalent sense. And so, in a pre-mass democracy context, you could have like a war that is not like a total war. Basically, is what I'm trying to say. But in the context of mass democracy, everything has to be like all or nothing. Because what you're doing is you're basically, the way mass democracy works is it uses propaganda to gas everybody up in the entire world to do one thing at the same time. So it's not just enough to motivate, you know, your aristocratic leaders to go to the battle and then you know, you sort out the differences and then you know, everybody goes back home. You have to gas up I'm sorry if this isn't very clear. In order to fight a kind of modern war, you have to gas up a lot of people to, you know, storm the trenches. And like millions of people might die in like 5 minutes. That's a very different kind of situation from the ideal. This is a difficult problem to solve. Anyway, let's rein it in here. Let's try and get back on track.
Sure. Just a note on democracy. I mean, I wouldn't say that Marxists see democracy itself as an inherent good, more so that it's kind of a historical progressive expression of a bourgeois society, and that. I mean, also partially ancient society, but it was kind of this necessary expression of bourgeois society, and that it is something that will be kind of sublated or overcome in a future socialist society where initially I'm sure there would be some democracy, but the idea would be that as society progresses and the means of production kind of eliminate the need for work and for distribution, then democracy itself kind of withers away. The need for it does. Once everybody more or less has everything they need and is able to do whatever they want to do, then that's how you kind of overcome democracy. I have a question though. we've talked to, we've noted left and right a few times. How do neo-reactionaries define left and right? What does it mean for you guys?
Great question. Great question. Thanks. And please feel free to like interrupt me and rein me in if I start spinning my wheels again. I know some of my answers have been a little bit long-winded. So I think there's two ways you can approach left and right. You can talk about things being left and right, kind of relative to a particular historical context, right? So there's a common kind of theory that left and right came into existence with the French Revolution, right? And that if you're on the left, that means you're more progressive, right? And if you're on the right, that means you're more conservative, either conservative or reactionary, right? And then so you can look at this whole spectrum, and then you can say, okay, to be progressive is farther left. To be a little bit less progressive than that is to be nearly liberal, I guess, or center left. Then to be, even less progressive than that is to be conservative or center right. And then after that, you go into the no man's land of this like dark, scary, reactionary territory. So one of the fundamental insights of neo-reaction is that, like today's like conservatives are usually more or less kind of yesterday's progressives. When you look at a lot of conservative political commentary, you see a lot of this stuff like, like a while ago, there was a Tucker Carlson monologue that was making the rounds. It was like, things were so much better in the 90s. Why can't we just go back to that 90s liberalism? Or, the tweet that inspired this conversation, right, from you, I think, not to put you on the spot, right, but you're like, oh, I just found out that it's right wing not to punch women in the face. What I'm here to tell you is that, yeah, that's right. You're welcome to the club now. Congratulations. The arc of history has moved away from where you thought it ought to kind of stay, and now you're a right winger now. Like, welcome to the club. But that's only if we define left and right relative, right? Relative to history, these historical conditions. If we were to define right and left wing in kind of like an absolute sense, I would say that it's fundamentally like a question of equality. How do you see the value of equality? The left wing, they love being, the ones who are punching up. They're the champions of equality, or, like equalizing things, or at least like championing like those who are kind of on like the bottom in like society. The right wing point of view is that inequality is either good or natural in some way, that it's fine, that there are benefits to everyone in society from having these inequalities. At least either that or that inequality is an irreducible kind of fact of social and political life, and we should go with the grain, not against it. So that's how I would define left and right.
Okay. I want to pick up on your point about equality. You mentioned in your blog that people, there's this idea that people get this warm and fuzzy feeling from the notion of universal human equality. I'm not sure that even liberals would really put it that way. And Marxists, I think, when Marxists and liberals talk about equality, when liberals talk about it, they mean equality under the law. They don't mean everybody's equal. They just mean that as far as the state and society and the law is concerned, everybody has the same station. And when Marxists talk about equality, it's basically just they mean the absence of class, not meaning that some people won't be better than others, not even necessarily that some people will be won't be richer than others. By the way, chat and people viewing this, I apologize for the blurriness of my face. My camera, for no reason, decided to stop learning how to focus. So we're gonna have to do the farther away back I sit, the better it works out. For equality for Marxists means just abolition of classes, and it's where one person doesn't get to own and others the means of production in society, and others do not. It's only that it's the abolition of classes, and where people are free to be as unequal as they want. You'll have better philosophers, you'll have worse philosophers, you'll have better workers, you have worse workers, and they will also get rewarded differently. That's not what equality for us does not mean everyone, equality of outcome, as is very commonly misunderstood by the right. So you can comment on that if you like.
This is good. These are all good points. Thanks for bringing that up. And it's a helpful clarification, right? To know that we're not talking about equality of outcome. The funny thing about equality of outcome, I think, is that no one's ever talking about it. But then, like, the less equality of outcome there is, the more panic we have, right? As far as a lot of these. Well, we can talk about wokeness later. So when you have the left, the fundamental kind of value undergirding what's left wing is that equality is some kind of fundamental political value. And when you look at, these conflicts between, liberals or the woke progressives who it seems that they very clearly do believe in equality of outcome, right, in some kind of fundamental sense. Or, the Marxist version of equality. What we have is all of these kind of different conflicts over what the meaning of the term equality is. So everyone's agreed that equality is good. It's a good thing. It's just, are we talking about equality under the law? Are we talking about having like a classless society situation, right, where no one's higher status than anyone else, or no one has more power than anyone else because of their birth or station or things like this? And so, to go back to kind of the political spectrum, right? The political spectrum, I think, particularly in the United States right now, it's split up between people who are, it's like the Chris Rufo types who are trying to return to, we're just going to have equality under the law. And then if that doesn't result in, 13% of airline pilots being African-American, then that's just what that is, right? Versus, there's these other camps who are saying, no, like, this equality under the law idea, this is a secret like mask of like some kind of like way we're actually oppressing all these people who aren't getting these equal outcomes. We need to adjust this, right? So these are the coordinates of what's considered left and right in kind of like the Overton window in the mainstream discourse. But from the neo-reactionary perspective, like the right wingers, they're not really they're not really quite as like right wing as we would suppose, right? And so you hear a lot of squawking on Twitter that like these people are fascists or whatever. But then you look at their actual kind of discourse, right? And really, they're still on board with the whole notion of equality. They're just trying to argue for a more outmoded kind of version of it, right?
Let's move on to nihilism and values, because you make you talk about that a bunch in the early part of your blog post there. You say that the West is overcome with nihilism, and that the way to defeat it, and that it's a problem, obviously, for you, and that nihilism can only be defeated by insight, inner strength, and will. And these are and modern values are have kind of superseded these old ancient old world values that helped, I don't know, keep the fabric of society together. And this is due to kind of liberal leftist brainwashing. Of course, someone like me would say, sure, this is all a symptoms of capitalism, and especially of capitalism in its senile decay. Now, there's the death of God with kind of the modern bourgeois era as well, but on the other side of it, you could say that pushing through capitalism to its conclusion, which would be socialism, is the way to get back, to get out of this trap of nihilism and to get back to life of meeting, because then people would be free to work together for shared purpose and kind of human solidarity and find meaning through self-directed life activity, aka self-directed work.
Okay, yeah, this is getting very 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 large in scope. This is great though. This is good. So concerning the issue of nihilism, right? We've been talking about modernity, right? And we've talked about modernity as this kind of process that's supposed to lead us through this gradual kind of progress to some kind of promised land, right? And some kind of utopia. But there have been these kind of earth-shattering cataclysmic shifts, right? In the process of undertaking this modern project of enlightenment, rationalization of the world, we've sort of dissolved the ground from beneath our feet. To quote from the Communist Manifesto, right? To stay with something your audience will be a little bit more familiar with. Marx famously says in there that all that is solid melts into air. I think this is fundamentally the world that we're dealing with today. We're dealing with a world in which everything solid has melted into air, and this is a process.
But why though?
Yeah, so that's the interesting question. That's one of the interesting questions, right? You want to talk about why? And so it's not. I'm not going to say that technology and capitalism have nothing to do with it. Obviously, I think that these things have a lot to do with the situation we're kind of in. And in particular, in the last kind of 50 to 100 years, there's even been like a almost kind of bizarre abiding faith that we can just use, like markets and technological gadgets to sort of replace even kind of like culture. Right? This is sort of like the neoliberal like idea. Instead of having, let's say like cultural norms or mores around, sexual relations, for example, we decided to have the sexual revolution, which was basically to turn, dating and marriage into a kind of marketplace, right? Where there's always, if you've been on like a dating app ever, you've basically been on Indeed, except for sex, right? Your dating profile is basically like a job application, right? That's one way you could kind of look at it, right? And so these are all different ways in which we've been fundamentally uprooted, and that's a process that we're going through. And we can't really just kind of bury our head in the ground and say like, oh well, if we just all kind of start going back to church, we'll like stop being like uprooted. Like no, like every like that thing isn't solid anymore. You're grasping at vapors when you try and do something like that. And then so how is Neoreaction a kind of response to this. For me, what is required, if we're going to, what we have to do is we have to try to think, how can we make it out to the other side of this? And when I say we, I don't. I mean this in kind of an evil, inegalitarian, exclusive sense. I don't think that most people are kind of psychologically like equipped to engage in this kind of thinking. I think that people, like, we're seeing that people are actually, for the most part, it's they're very uncomfortable with this idea that they can't like rely on, you know, the good old fashioned values, whether those old fashioned values are, you know, like church, family, capitalism, whatever, or whether it's, you know, from the neo-reactionary perspective, the old fashioned values of progress, you know, equality, you know, like the state, or, you know, right, these kind of like utopian projects of like the Enlightenment. Like we people want to be able to just have something they can rely on. And if you think about, okay, let's think about like okay, well I'll go back to Marx, since you guys are all Marxists, right? In the contribution to the critique of Hegel's phenomenology of right, Karl Marx says that the most fundamental form of critique is the critique of religion, right? If you don't undergo this critique of religion, right, you don't like unmask religion as this force that just kind of acts as this like opium of the people, right? You're never going to kind of fully disclose like the way in which like these ideological machinations like keep us trapped, right? And there might be some truth to that, but that's like a very hard like pill for like a lot of people, right? And like for like most people, like they just don't like live their lives doing that kind of intellectual heavy lifting. But we are in a situation, I think, where fundamentally, right, we've lost the things that used to keep our culture kind of glued together, right? Everything's become unglued.
Sure.
Everything's become dislocated, right? Everything is now a lifestyle choice, right? You know, like no one's ever gonna, you know, come at you and say like, oh, that's un-American. You can't do that. You can't believe that. Although like, I think some, and then, so I'm sorry, I'm spinning my wheels again a little bit. But to bringing this back to, but the problem of nihilism, it's just so broad that you can't really keep it in a kind of simple little box. But the way I see this process, it's something that we don't have the choice of. It's one of the one things that we don't have the choice of like opting out of. This is just simply something that has happened. And it's something that I think we can get through to the other side of, but it will take, this is a thing that will take like generations. It's not something we can sort of leap into pell-mell. And then, so why is neo-reaction kind of like a way out of this? I think that the fundamental like issue with nihilism is that we've become kind of dislocated. This is almost kind of like Nietzschean, right? Is we've been fundamentally like dislocated from the things that provide like real value by these sort of transcendental ideas, by, you know, religion even, right? In particular, the Judeo-Christian religion, right? We've been taught. We've become accustomed to finding all of our values in some kind of beyond world. You could even look at like the Marxist utopia of like the perfect communist like state of affairs or whatever, right?
Well, we
That's
don't.
something that's not here in this world,
But
right?
Marx never did that specifically. Like he critiqued the utopians and he made fun of them for coming up with these ideas. It's the idea that we can kind of dream up and plan out the perfect utopia is pretty anti-Marxist actually.
Yeah, I think there's this tension in Marx because the core of it, the core of the Marxist critique is like we're going to take all these like sentimentalities, right, and drown them in the ice cold bathwater of real, historical analysis, right? And I don't necessarily have a problem with that, right? But he has to sustain this, like very kind of harsh, cynical critique by keeping like another foot in like the kind of moralistic sphere of, but we're doing this for the sake of making the world like a better place, and it's going to be like, this kind of wonderland where you can fish in the morning and critique the theater at night or whatever. That's kind of what I meant there. Does
Sure.
that kind of make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, so anyways, yeah, my intention in with this kind of neo-reactionary thinking, to bring it in conversation with nihilism, is I think that we can draw on these more kind of ancient values without throwing away the things that we've gained that are of value from modernity, and kind of use this to kind of like carry like the torch through to the other side of this process. But that's something that's necessarily going to take time.
Let's jump ahead to one of the key elements of neo-reaction, as it's commonly understood, and that's the idea of the cathedral, which I kind of liked, but to me it seemed just like a reconstitution of other ideas that have been already worked out, like the PMC, the idea of the professional managerial class, from Burnham to the Ehrenreichs to Catherine Liu, and there's a lot of work on that stuff already. There's also the idea of the urban monoculture, which I've heard from another idea I kind of thought was interesting from other neo-reactionaries. I don't know if you're familiar with the Based Camp YouTube channel, and those the wife and husband couple who are big into Peter Thiel and their own subgenre of neo-reaction.
I haven't had the pleasure.
Okay, well, yeah, I think they're kind of blowing up right now, actually, and they're big JD Vance fans. Anyway, so to me, what the cathedral sounds like the PMC, more or less, or in PMC ideology. And what cathedral lacks is kind of a deeper materialist analysis, although its descriptive power is not wrong, really. And I'll just sum it up, and you can tell me if I got this right or wrong. So the cathedral sets itself up against God and nature herself, seeks to wield power of social engineering, to usurp what belongs to nature by right, and transform the human being into an infinitely malleable, unfree, inhuman, technological abortion. These are your words, by the way. Tell me if that sums it up.
Yeah. So in that passage, I was specifically kind of describing the cathedral in the aspect of what is the underlying ideology that the cathedral is centered around, right? So when we're talking about the cathedral, one of the things that's very important about this is it's a mode of power that does not work through like direct kind of brute force. It doesn't even work necessarily in the kind of more indirect way of like, so like the most direct like exercise of power, you have like the master slave, and the master's gonna beat you if you don't do the thing or whatever. Or and then more indirect than that, you have like, you know, skipping ahead a little bit, you've got like your boss, and like your boss gives you money if you do things that he tells you to do, and then if you stop doing that, he'll kind of like stop giving you money. Like the cathedral doesn't even have that kind of like direct way of exercising power. So with respect to the cathedral, it's the way it exercises power is through kind of maintaining a kind of monopoly on the sort of ideas that are disseminated in a mass democratic society. So that quote earlier, which I kind of have to laugh at a little bit, it's not that I disagree with any of it. I have to laugh at a little bit of my purple prose sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
It's a description of kind of what the cathedral believes, right? It is, so there is an aspect in which this is a belief system we're talking about, but sort of why is it a belief system, right? And so I want to bring this in to a kind of more materialist analysis, and then hopefully that'll be helpful for you too, because it is also supposed to be that. But in order to understand what the cathedral is, you also need to understand kind of what it's promoting, and these are all going to be connected together because the cathedral, it's one of its sources of power is the way in which it's able to kind of associate itself with this notion of progress as such. I'm getting too ahead of myself, though. I can already feel people in the audience getting lost. So what is the cathedral, right? I think one of the ways we can think about the cathedral is we can think about the concept of the separation of church and state, right? Like in the American kind of liberal political system. And then so what's the purpose of separation of church and state, right? Ask yourself that question. Okay, what's the purpose of separation of church and state? Well, the purpose of separation of church and state is that in a democracy or in a liberal democracy, maybe those are that's a pleonasm, whatever. What we're supposed to be doing is we're supposed to be having these very highly literate, like high information, like highly educated conversations with one another about what we should be doing as a country, what kind of laws we should have. And based on those conversations, we get together every so often and we vote for people who are going to carry out some kind of plan of action that we agree with based on like where we locate ourselves in these discussions we're having, right? We're engaging in this Enlightenment project of having a rational conversation with each other about what kind of society we should live in, what kind of things we should be doing, right? Should we go to war with Mexico and take all those juicy territories they have, right? Or should we do something else? These are, or whatever conversation, right? Should we legalize gay marriage? Should we do this? Should we do that? The reason that separation of church and state is essential, and the reason the founding fathers would have defined it as essential to having this kind of democracy is that if you don't have separation of church and state, this short circuits the entire process of having these conversations about what we should be doing. Does that make sense? Like if we did not have separation of church and state, we wouldn't have like a real discussion about like what we should vote on. Everyone would be going to the same church every weekend, and then the priest or the bishop or whoever would get up on the pulpit and they would say, thanks for coming in, guys. By the way, here's the platform of the church. on who you should vote for in the election, and if you guys don't vote this way, you'll be very bad, or you'll be excommunicated, or whatever, right? And then we would, like, let's say we have no separation of church and state, and there's an election. You go to the polls, right? And oh, would you look at that? It's like a clean sweep of all the things the church told everyone to vote on, right? So that's what the founding fathers were trying to sort of avoid, right? By putting in the separation of church and state. The cathedral is a kind of informal state church, in the sense that you're not allowed to explicitly have a kind of state religion that's enforced on everybody, but through a few layers of kind of indirection, we've been able to smuggle in what's effectively the same kind of power structure as having a state religion or a state church, but we don't call it a church. Our state religion, it's modern, it's secular, right? It doesn't believe in God, but it still believes in progress, right? Which is almost as kind of the same thing as saying providence, but we don't call it providence, right? And they don't do exorcisms, right? They don't come to your house and clean it of evil spirits. So technically, it's not a religion, right? Although de facto, it kind of works like the same way, and it scratches the same itch that a lot of people have. But because it's not technically a religion, right? You can go and be a social studies teacher, and you can teach, intersectional feminism at the same level of zealous, frenzied moral agitation that, a Jehovah's Witness would teach, their children in the privacy of their own home. But you couldn't get away with doing that in like a public school. No. Like, you couldn't go be an English teacher and be like, we're going to read the New Testament all year and learn how Jesus saves. And you couldn't do that, right? But you can do that with intersectional feminism. And then that's where you get all this libs of TikTok stuff. So anyway, yeah. So basically, the idea of the cathedral is that in a mass democratic society, there's a lot of power in kind of nudging people into thinking that they spontaneously want to vote the way the ruling class wants them to, or not even just voting, like the people who control, if you control academia, if you control the media, if you control, what people are even thinking about in the first place, then you can control kind of like what direction they're going to go. It's a way of kind of nudging everything in advance, and it effectively constitutes a kind of state religion. But so then where's like the hard material class analysis here? Well, the class analysis here is that the cathedral, it's not just these beliefs, right? Which I summarized in the quote there. It's that there are people who act as the functionaries of this state religion, right? So there's people who are oligarchs in the sense of they're like George Soros, or, whoever your right-wing boogeyman is, Peter Thiel, they own these companies, blah, blah, blah. But there's the other part of the oligarchy, which isn't so much like the throne part or, the business part, but it's it serves the altar function as well, right? Throne and altar. We got rid of throne and altar when the aristocrats went away, but we still have kind of the same thing. It's just that it's this secular, technocratic altar, right? Where you get this mainstream religion of the professional managerial class, which is, it's secular, so it doesn't count technically, but it's still a state religion. I feel like I'm repeating myself. Is that?
Yeah. So are you suggesting that the cathedral, the religion of the PMC, more or less, is this kind of a self-directed, like, is it its own thing, or is it a symptom of the domination of capital over these institutions, and over the PMC kind of strata itself. Like, is it capitalism kind of leading the charge here, or is it this middle class? Like, is this middle class acting autonomously, kind of as its own force in society, to uphold the ruling class ideology?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there's a little bit of both. I think that there's obviously there's a lot of explicit astroturfing that happens, and this is where people get into kind of like the notion of like, oh, there's woke capital, right? Or what have you. Like if you look at there's a blog by a gentleman named Zachary Goldberg that's very famous, that makes the rounds every once in a while, where he measures like the frequency of the words like sexism, racism, blah 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 in like the top 5 newspapers. And if you look at like 2011, which is when Occupy Wall Street happened, right? Like up until then, it's kind of flat, and then after that, it like explodes, right? So, like, if you're kind of conspiratorially like minded, like you look at a graph like that, and then you think someone somewhere made a phone call, and they were like, "Hey, Joe, let's crank it up with these themes in the paper," right? So you could see something of a top-down aspect to it, but I think also there's a large extent to which like people do like improvise, and it is kind of like a spontaneous like class consciousness of this PMC. You call it bourgeois, right? But it's this class of people whose main sort of form of social status and their main form of power isn't that they own the means of production, or that they're these like gallant knights or military people, or like what's their main form of social status? It's that they're knowledge producers, or that they're teachers, or they're technocrats, they're some kind of expert in something, or they're an MBA, so they're an expert in administration science in some kind of general sense, and that's where their power comes from. And they're very keen on the idea that they have somehow, they either have or they earn the right to be believed, because they are the expert that knows these facts, and everyone else should be dependent on them for their understanding of X, Y, or Z phenomena, right? And we saw these people going absolutely bananas during COVID. But that's only just one example, right? So basically, yeah, the class analysis angle here is that so you can Machiavelli says there's kind of 3 class elements of society. You have the prince, and that's just one guy. When you have a situation where there's one guy who's in charge of everything. You also have aristocracies, and you have the masses, or the people. And there's a good and bad version of all of these things. But when you have a malignant aristocracy, that's called an oligarchy. And that's basically what we have, I think, with the cathedral, is we have a kind of malignant oligarchy. But it's an oligarchy whose power is ultimately derived from their ability to propagandize the rest of society.
I mean,
we were talking about an interesting question. Can you remind me what the original thread was?
Yeah. God, we were talking the PMC, the role of the cathedral. Oh no, sorry. We were talking about whether it's capital that that's kind of pushing all this and weakening the institutions, so that this class or the strata becomes kind of.
Oh, okay. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. So yeah, so I think there's an element of kind of both. On the one hand, you can go back through our recent history, and you can see like a lot of proto kind of, or well, so on the neo-reactionary analysis, right? The cathedral, it's it's what happens when this modern Enlightenment ideology of like progress meets 20th century kind of mass democratic social technology and kind of class structures generally, right? But so in as far as that's the case, a lot of this belief is like organic, right? This is like the closest thing a lot of people have with our contemporary society, with our contemporary education system, like to some kind of like religious belief. And I think religion in general, I think that this is one thing Marx kind of got. I think like when you read Marx, there's a kind of sense in which he seems to sort of think we can just kind of like throw religion in the waste bin and like march forward into like a braver tomorrow where everyone's just free and secular and this and that. I think that what we're beginning to learn is that something like a common belief, even if you don't necessarily want to call it religion, but common belief is something that's kind of like an existential structure of our societies. At the same time, though, when we're talking about like the cathedral, we are talking about something that is constitutive of the way our society is structured. And then, in as much as that's the case, like, yes, like the ruling class, like, however you want to define that, on the neo-reactionary analysis, the ruling class is included as part of this cathedral. Because the way that they exert power, right? When you have like mass democracy, one of the issues like mass democracy has is just the sheer scale of the thing. So like feudalism was able to work because the way people lived back then, most people would live in like a small village where all of the food that they ate all year was grown locally, and you would have like 100 or 200 people working the land together, and then you would have like one guy who was like the baron, and he would be like the guy who's in charge. And like if he like didn't do a good job of being in charge, you would like lynch him and get like a new baron or whatever, right? But because of the scale of it, power was able to work in that kind of direct, kind of face-to-face way. But in the 20th century, society became so massive that increasingly propaganda becomes necessary in order to organize this society. And then so you see this even in societies that are supposedly totalitarian, right? It's not democracy because it's totalitarian. Well, totalitarianism, as we said earlier, is kind of a synonym for mass democracy, because even in these totalitarian conditions where, let's say, I don't know, like the National Socialists have like canceled like all elections, they're still engaging in this game of mass democracy, right? Or even in the Soviet Union, right? They're still engaging in this game of mass democracy because even though the population, they're not voting on things, they're still constantly being propagandized, right? They're constantly being told by the media, this is who we are, this is what we're about as a people, this is why you have to go to the Eastern Front and fight the Reds, or this or that or the other thing. And that's kind of like the basic structure of the cathedral. When we're talking about the cathedral, we're kind of talking about the way in which Washington, D.C. kind of also acts as like a nexus of this sort of totalitarian system, but for the entire West as such. But it's not just for the West anymore. It's planetary, right? And we try to. It's this soft power we exert over the whole world. And then so there's an element of it where it's there is direct intervention by the ruling class, but it also, the claim is this is kind of the ruling class itself, is this cathedral. The ruling class is this kind of priest caste of technocrats, in a certain sense. And, like individually, none of these people who like write all these white papers all day long about stakeholder capitalism or whatever, individually they don't necessarily have like a lot of power, but together they all work to create this environment, this propagandized environment, which is supposed to try and steer our society in one direction or the other.
Yeah, this is a good way to talk about wokeism in general, and what it is, why it exists, where it came from. You mentioned that it's kind of a secular religious belief, and I totally agree. And actually, this is one of the very few things I am in full agreement with James Lindsay on. I think that
Oh dear.
he's full. He does a good job of explaining how wokeism has just become the replacement for the secular replacement for the death of meaning and of God and religion, and it makes perfect sense that this kind of new cult would rise up in place of meaning and purpose found in religion, because capitalist society, and especially late capitalist society, in the last 50 years or so, the meaning is being stripped even more than it had been prior. But I think what James is missing is that this religious belief, this wokeism, is really a symptom of the failure of socialism and the death of the left, right? This regression from politics, and particularly class politics, since the death of kind of the leftism and the labor movement, leaves people with nothing else but looking inward, looking into questions of identity, and looking at identity politics in general, postmodernism, changing discourse in order to change the world. These are all kind of ways to feel like you're doing something radical without actually engaging in real politics, and transgression and all this kind of nonsense. And the reason wokeism has been adopted by came out of academia, but adopted by the ruling class, especially in the last 10 years, 15 years, is because of its use in dividing and disciplining the working class, right? Every HR departments in particular have grown by orders of magnitude in strength of what they actually do. Now, precisely because of this that the ruling class has found that how useful these ideas are for kind of this class erasure, which happens on both sides, right? I think, and you mentioned propaganda. I'd say in the 20th century and how it evolved, I'd say it's a symptom. It's also a symptom of capitalism and the need to suppress class struggle in particular, by promoting either myths of nationalism for the reactionaries and the conservatives, or on the progressive side, class erasure, intersectionality, wokeism, like the idea that a gay trans worker is faces the same struggles as a gay trans billionaire. This is all different forms of ruling class ideology in the form of erasing class and trying to make trying to suppress politics.
And it's I think a lot of people they get caught up in all this friend enemy stuff online and yelling at each other, and it's easy to lose sight of how kind of like there's a dialectic where both sides they do try and kind of keep things they want to keep everybody coloring in the lines, whether you're on the left or the right. That's definitely true. And then on the left in particular, right, you have, I mean, there's these critiques of, like wokeness. It's like the anything but class left, is what some people have called it, right? And like that's not wrong, but I don't see this as necessarily like an abandonment of class. It's more so that I think like people on the left have come to realize that, oh hey, wait a minute, like we're not just a bunch of like broke like college students, or like we're not just a bunch of like middling kind of like HR workers. Like we are the ruling class. We live in a kind of society where high information, like high knowledge, like those are the high status things, and it feels kind of nice to be on top. And like I think that's why like part of the reason we're getting all this like and yeah. So the ruling class, like, or the system. Let's just talk about the system, like generally, right? You go back to the early 2000s. It's a lot of rah. It's the flag. It's we're never gonna forget 9/11, right? We're gonna, this like very like macho kind of pandering to middle America, conservative kind of culture. We're gonna be tough. We're not gonna let those terrorists change our freedoms, right? And I think a lot of leftists, like who grew up at this time, like they had a kind of sense that they were like the underdogs, like because of this. But then all of a sudden, like 2016 happens, and Bernie Sanders' campaign gets completely trounced, and he's telling you to go vote for the establishment now, and like Donald Trump wins, and then all of a sudden, the CIA is on MSNBC every day, parroting your talking points about how Donald Trump is like a fascist or whatever, right? Or like I didn't count, but it seems like something like half of the commentators on MSNBC that started being there around that area, whether it's like Malcolm Nance, right, or these other guys, a lot of them just go straight from the CIA to MSNBC, right? So you're not even just talking about like Operation Mockingbird or whatever, where they're like slipping it in. It's like, no, like the CIA goons are going directly to MSNBC. And it's not that I don't have anything in principle against the CIA, or whatever. I mean, like people need, like intelligence work, right? It's not the prettiest reality, but it has to. But so what you did see on the left at that point was a lot of people just kind of saw that reality, and then instead of retaining this like antagonistic stance to a lot of those institutions that it would have been easy for them to do, back in the George Bush era, they go, oh, what the fuck? I love the CIA now. I'm sorry. Is it okay to curse on this channel?
Go ahead.
Okay, this isn't a Christian channel. Okay, it's okay to be a little bit profane. All right, sorry. I forgot to ask what the. But anyway, yeah. I mean, does that kind of make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, did we lose you?
No. Go on. Go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry. Just tie that up in a little bow for us before you end there.
Yeah. So, but anyways, yeah. So I think that it's good to try and kind of analyze this like phenomenon of wokeness from this angle. So on the one hand, it is like a way in which like this like class of people, like they get to be the ones that are like introducing all of these like alien and like bizarre and like weird like social norms like into society. And like because they're the ones who like have they're like the technical experts of social justice.
Yeah.
Almost in a certain sense, right? And like social justice, like it's not just like this like simple thing. It's become this extremely convoluted thing that you need like a PhD in sociology to understand, and it's constantly changing all the time. So you can't just have that. You also have to be on Tumblr all day long, or like left-wing Twitter or whatever, to keep abreast of like what's politically correct, what's not politically correct. But uh crap. Yeah, in addition to that, there's also this aspect of, in a time where, like, a lot of people on the right, they try to look at this phenomenon of wokeness and they say, okay, it's not just like something that happened in the last 10 years, right? You go back to like the Civil Rights Act, like, I'm sorry, but that was woke too, right? You look at a lot of things like Martin Luther King Jr. said, and like, it's, he was kind of a communist, right? And he was like going out and saying like a lot of things that kind of sound like Abraham Kennedy, right?
Did
So
he though?
yeah. He was he advocated for like basically like an early version of like the disparate impact. Like, if there's disparate impact, then we need to go in and adjust that, so that there's a quality of outcome. I don't have an exact citation for that, but anyways, like, you can go back and you can look at this. But I think one thing that I think gets missed by both sides is the dynamic in which, when we were dealing with earlier versions of this like progressive ideology, right, the pre-woke version of it, this was at a time where things in the West, and because of the Marshall Plan in Europe, but in the United States, because we had won World War II, we had this like booming like economy, right? Things were pretty good. So when you had a lot of these kind of like what people call like the proto-woke arguments, like back then, it was from a place of like abundance. It was, oh, isn't it like so unfortunate we have this like great society, but like these people are being left behind. We need to bring them in. Things are much nastier today. And like when people are talking about like wokeness specifically, they're trying to distinguish it from these earlier kind of forms of progressivism, which it did kind of evolve from in a way. But so what's really going on here, I think, if you look at it from like a class perspective, right, as those on your channel are wont to do, what's going on is that, at a time where it's the post-2008 economy, okay? Like, it's post-NAFTA. These illusions of, like the illusion of we're going to be on top forever, it's the end of history, the economy's fine, they persisted up until a certain point, like beyond where that was still true. Like even in the 90s, like things were already starting to get rickety. Things were technically, I mean, you could even go back to stagflation, the 70s, right, as like maybe the beginning of some of the troubles. But we were able to do things to kind of paper over that, right? We started giving everyone like these like goofy credit cards or whatever.
That's funny. That's exactly what I was I was thinking of when you
Yeah,
said that.
yeah. So you have stagflation, and wages aren't going up, but you start giving people credit cards, right?
Women enter the workforce as well.
Yes, yeah, exactly, right. And so even though it things were kind of beginning to start to go on the downturn, you can make things like feel like they weren't. But then sometime around like the late 90s, around 2008, that kind of changed. Like things started hitting really hard. And then you go further into the 2010s, you start having the opioid epidemic. And one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever read, and this did like, I think something in terms of kind of like leaning me kind of more to like the right, is that I read there was a news, I forget what the article was, it was so long ago, but it was kind of just at the beginning of this like post OWS, like the woke jargon was starting to go around in the media. Everyone has to be like an intersectional feminist in this, and like this woman was talking about like conditions in her community, and it was like her husband had like died of an opioid overdose, right? After they had suffered some kind of job loss, right, in the wake of the Great Recession, and like she's talking about this, and then she like stops herself, and she starts doing like a kind of woke self criticism in the middle of this. She's like, "Oh well, I know that as a white woman, I have all this privilege and blah blah blah." It's like you're talking about like your husband who like died of like a opioid overdose when like the Sacklers are like carpet bombing this country in these drugs, and it's like you can't even be like the main like the main character, whatever. You can't center yourself, right, because you're being fed this woke ideology that says like, and then so it's like, what's the class angle here, right? At a time where the middle class is effectively being dissolved, is collapsing, right? It's becoming harder and harder to be middle class. People are losing these jobs. They're getting outsourced, or like with the open borders, right? Like which Bernie Sanders called a Koch brothers idea, right? There's all this like everything's a global race to the bottom, and then there's drugs in the streets. This is not like the world that the baby boomers and the Gen Xers came up with. This is like a much darker reality for people who are lower class and people who are middle class, and I still have a lot of sympathy for that. But like at a time where things are going in this much darker direction, this woke ideology is coming out and saying, if you're white, if you're a man, you don't have a right to complain. You don't have a right to your own grievances because, like, oh, if you're white, you don't know what it's like to be poor. Or, and like, I mean, that's messed up. Like, and if you're kind of class first, like leftist, like Angela Nagel or one of these people, I mean, you have to look at that and go like, wait a minute, like maybe I can have some sympathy or empathy for these, like, we got to look at marginalized perspectives, like we forget them sometimes, blah blah blah. But like if you're a class first kind of like person, one of these leftists, or like I'm sure all of you are, or some of you, what have you, like most of the quote unquote working class in the United States, in Europe, are going to be white, right? So what does it do when you have a situation where you take a population that's the majority of your country that you live in, and then you say these people don't have a right to have grievances, right? Which is what the woke ideology does. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you, oh wait, I just lost it. So you seem to obviously understand that capitalism, in capitalist society, creates a lot of these problems that you kind of want to overcome. So that brings me to kind of the neo part of Neoreaction, right? And so you guys are marrying, you want to marry the best advances of technology with classical political thought. So, but for me, it's, and you guys are big on order, but capitalism itself and the technologies, it's the technologies of capitalism, they are the ultimate kind of form of disorder, right? Crises, class struggle, anarchy, waste, inefficiencies across economies. Like these are all symptoms of capitalism. So, does a neo-reaction, like what's your theory of change here? Like, does a neo-reaction society, neo-reactionary society, also abandon capitalism? And if so, how? Because Marxists, as far as I understand, are the only ones who figured out, that you need the dictatorship of the proletariat to actually overcome a capitalist society and move on to the next phase, whatever that is. So, given all that, how do the neo-reactionaries, who are anti-Marxists or not Marxists, figure that this is going to happen for them?
Great question. Yeah. So what I would, so in the broad strokes and even in a lot of the fine strokes, yeah, I sympathize with a lot of what you have to say about capitalism. I don't believe that, however, that like capitalism is something we can kind of self-consciously like leap out of, if that makes sense. What so like if we were good to go back to like the 1200s, for example, like I don't think that a bunch of monks sitting around like theory crafting like a different way of society could like turn society into like non-feudal, right? There's an element of these economic technologies like in which like they are the result of what you would call like material productive forces. But there are a lot of these excesses of capitalism. Capitalism is like an excess machine in a certain respect, and we do believe that that has to be reined in. But in a lot of ways,
So
like
you're a
human life,
Bernsteinian.
like maybe, yeah, but like we could for the neo-reactionary, right? And I can only speak for myself here, but I think that one of the fundamental problems with our situation is the way in which our contemporary ideology, because in as far as it's this like liberal, blank slatist view of human affairs, there's this kind of notion that like there's this fundamental equality between Elon Musk and like the guy who's working like 80 hours a week at 3 jobs and pulling in like 50K a year or whatever, or like someone even worse off than that, right? There's a fundamental equality between these two people in the sense of like society has been gamified. It's in a kind of fundamental way, everything's just the open market, and that guy who's like not doing well could have just made different life decisions and he would have been Elon Musk.
Mm-hmm.
So everything's fair. That only makes sense if you obtain to this left-wing notion of equality of human capacities, right? It's just in a general sense. But like, so because we have this kind of notion, we sort of like allow the economy, society, whatever, to run amok. For the neo-reactionary, that's a mistake. That's something that we believe is a good thing to do because of certain modern progressive or relatively progressive kind of ideas. And insofar as we're neo-reactionaries, we believe that so in the first, you see a lot of people talking about like a new aristocracy, this kind of thing, right? Or just kind of like a reassertion of social inequality. Like that's not coming from a place, I think, of fundamentally like greedy kind of like, oh well, I just want to be the king and then everyone has to do what I want to do. Sure. And I'm just going to be Caligula. And although that would maybe be kind of cool, I think it's fun when rich people are kind of ostentatious, right? And like flaunt their wealth. I don't like this new paradigm of like the Mark Zuckerberg rich guy who wears like the jeans and the gray shirt and like acts like he's like one of the guys or whatever, right? But anyway, no,
he does not like he's one of the guys. Oh my god, he actually can.
Well, alien. He doesn't. Yeah. It's totally fake, right? Like just but anyway, yeah. To get back to it, I think that so for me, one of the things about neo-reaction is what we're trying to do is we're trying to go back and say, hey, what ideas have we left on the table because they're like quote unquote not progressive or whatever, and therefore it's bad, that could actually be kind of good ideas. I think returning to a kind of idea of sort of noblesse oblige, right, of obliged nobility, that if you do have power, that does kind of come with some responsibility, right? So it's not just your right to just like enjoy your power because like you earned it, and everyone else is like an idiot for not earning it, that kind of thing, right? No, I mean like if you have like one of these kind of like higher station like jobs, a lot of the time, that's tied to it's there's a lot of jobs where you need like a certain IQ range in order to perform the job correctly. Like if you're going to be like an engineer at like a nuclear reactor, right? I think like the threshold is like it's something around like 130 IQ points, right? Um, but anyways, yeah. But so I think the neo-reactionary solution is that if you want to have order and for order to be local, um, you're going to have some people who are, running things, some people who are in charge of stuff. We're never going to be able to get rid of that. But, with that power is going to come some kind of responsibility to everyone else in society. But then there's also responsibilities that you have if you're like not the boss, right? You've got to show up and, contribute, do your job. And, sometimes you're going to have to follow orders a little bit, right? I mean, like if you have like a job at Starbucks, that's the way it is, right? That's kind of, from our perspective, that's not really like that's an irreducible kind of like aspect of like life. Like we're not going to be able to gig economyify everything in the world where it's all like completely voluntary in that respect. But I don't know. Is that an adequate answer?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're sort of getting at a neo version of the old style of freedom, where you were free. Like freedom meant freedom to be what you are, who you are, freedom to kind of be the best peasant, be the best entrepreneur, and flourish in that kind of what you're meant to be as in your given your capacities to either rule or to serve or to do whatever. So is that sort of what you're getting at?
Yeah. I'm not allergic to that. Yeah, that sounds fine.
Okay, cool. So then, all right. So then, am I still if I push back a little bit on this let's say non-aversion to capitalism? You're talking about its excesses that are obviously bad, and then the free markets and the kind of allowing it to do its own thing needs to be reined in. So and then I quipped that you're kind of a Bernsteinian in that sense. Now, so yeah, I mean, my argument would be that is like the and you talked about the obliged nobility. So how do you get an obliged nobility while the incentives of capitalism remain in place, right? You can't really enforce that if the incentives are still there to compete and and the tendency towards monopoly, the centralization of capital and power all still exist. It's just kind of like this river of directional, like societal direction, all going in one way, that you can't really equalize, right? And Rosa Luxemburg's whole point in Reform or Revolution was that Bernstein was delusional in the idea that he could create some sort of equilibrium, a balance between workers and the petty bourgeois and the ruling class, and that you could somehow get rid of once and for all the crises of capitalism and the class struggle. To me, it sounds like Bernstein was doing a left version of what you are kind of suggesting, but I just don't think, from what we know about capitalism, and thanks to Marx and especially people like Grossman and Ted Rees, that the tendency is unharnessable, if I could put it that way. Like you can't undo that. There's no way to keep keep capitalism in place and have any kind of stable society, right? That's the main difference, right? And that's what capitalism drives progress in the sense of technological development and expanding the means of production, but it also drives itself into the ground by abolishing its own source of surplus value as it gets more and more efficient and heads towards automation, and the rate of profit approaches zero. So to me, that means Marxism and the dictatorship of the proletariat and the attempts at socialism, however poorly they may have been tried before, however distasteful some of these ideas might be to you, it seems like just it's ultimately the only way out.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So I'll start with the kind of notion of like how are we going to. There's a question of like how can we change the way we think about class in our society when it seems like it's on this like one track capitalist rationality, or it's all going like the capitalist machinations all go in one direction, right? So how do you get that turned in
How do you create a stable society while leaving capitalism in place?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. And so one of the things we try to emphasize in the sort of neo-reactionary sphere is that history is not stable. Stability is an important part of like creating order, but you also you acknowledge like the reality, right? And the historical reality is that what goes up must come down. All civilizations go through these cycles of ascent and decline. And in as much as that's the case, like your goal is to try and do the best you can with the sort of situation that you have, right? And so there's been societies that have been founded that kind of fizzled out really fast and they didn't do so good. There's also societies that last, like ancient Sparta. They're like they were founded by just these like two kings, and they were all the laws for them at the same time, and it lasted for like 800 or 900 years. That's a pretty good run. So you're shooting for having a pretty good run. We're not. I sympathize with the attempts to like look at history scientifically, right? And there's a kind of Promethean responsibility that comes with this ability to look at history scientifically, right? You want to kind of figure out how you can ride the waves, or maybe what direction you could even be steering it in. But from my perspective, my kind of conservative kind of proclivity here is that there's only like so much you can do with respect to this. And yeah, you just like it's better to kind of just go with the grain of nature. As far as kind of like, how are we going to get from where we are now to this kind of neo-reactionary understanding of class or whatever, I think that there's already a kind of tendency within sort of the ruling class to you see it, I think, in a lot of this stuff, although a lot of it is extremely misguided. These discussions that they're having about like stakeholder capitalism and like the steady state society or whatever, or even degrowth, which but right, I think in a lot of these discussions they're already, I think, trying to think about the ways in which we've accidentally like undermined the abilities of our societies to reproduce ourselves by focusing too much on like chasing these metrics like GDP or these like flows of capital and so on. But there isn't yet a kind of coherent way to think about how to move from point A to point B. And I think that by kind of clarifying where a lot of our ideological confusion comes from, which is why this critique of the cathedral is so important. We can kind of clear away a lot of the roughage, or the kind of flotsam and jetsam that's getting in the way of us being able to think clearly about how we could have like a new, still technologically advanced, like kind of like society that works better than what we have now. Because I think everyone has a kind of sense that what we have now, it's going down a bad track. And it's not just that it's going down a bad track; it's that the track is like very like it's like a railway track. It's not like a car where you can just kind of swerve anywhere you want. We
Pull
are
over to
on
the side of the
rails.
road. Yeah.
Yeah. You can't just like pull over when you need to take a nap, right? It's going down the rails, and it's kind of going pretty fast at this point, right? And I don't know anyone who's like happy with the direction it's going in. Right? Even if we're talking about kind of like the ruling class, like it's like there's a lot of panic among these people. Like these people, like they can look at the internet just as much as anyone else, right? And like what they see is that like people are not having a good time. People are not enjoying being ruled over by these people. People are having a very bad time, in fact, and there's a lot of blame that's being thrown around, and like that makes people nervous, right? And sometimes that makes them nervous, and it makes them want to form rank and think about how they can stay in control. But it also inspires people to kind of think about, like how could things maybe be different so that maybe everyone isn't so mad at us all the time, right? And I think it's in that way. I think there is like a potential for us to go in a better direction.
Um, I before closing out, I did want to mention that your article talked about cybernetics, and that it represents
Yes.
the science of organization, that neo-reactionaries would posit, and I would say that Marxists, at least they agree, or at least they should agree. In particular, if you have any interest in looking up kind of the left or the Marxist take on cybernetics, Derek Varn's channel has a few good episodes where he talks about cybernetics, um, and called Varn Vlog. We have some disagreements on other things, but it's pretty cool on that stuff. Allende's Chile is an interesting case where they were actually working on kind of implementing a type of cybernetic um, system back in the 70s, but obviously
Yeah, that was actually Stafford Beer was the guy that they were
right.
working with there.
Yeah. Anyway, so I mean, I suppose it could be used for a neo-reactionary society in theory as well. But yeah, Marxists that definitely take up that question. I'd like you to give us just a quick rundown of. I'm going to name a few people, and I want you to give me your thoughts, your neo-reactionary thoughts on the following people, and then we can kind of close out soon after that. So Curtis Yarvin, obviously, the so-called father of neo-reaction. J.D. Vance, Trump, and Nick Land. It'd be cool if you could comment on those four.
Yeah, I'll do my best to run through that really quick. So Yarvin is he's the arc neo-reactionary. Anyone who's interested in kind of looking at the original sort of like expression of this ideology should go back and look at his old blog, Unqualified Reservations, for short. There's a lot of good stuff there. I would check out his essay on formalism. Also, how Dawkins got pwned. I think does a good. It's a funny name, yeah. He has a great sense of humor. It does a good job of kind of like tying together both the kind of class structure of what the cathedral is, along with the kind of ideology. He does a little bit of a genealogy of it, starting from what was at that time very popular, the kind of new atheist movement, going back into the origins of that from out of American kind of Puritan ideology, actually. And then you'll notice that geographically, the Puritans lived in exactly the same place where you find Harvard and Yale and MIT and all of these other Ivy League schools, which are at the center of this cathedral even today, right? And like, yeah, Yarvin, he's a guy who's been around for a long time. He's one of the elders. He throws some balls and some strikes. But like, his most interesting and important work is from that Unqualified Reservations blog. You can get a hard copy of that. What is it? The Passage Press. If you guys know about that, yeah, you can find a hard copy there, but it's also available for free on the internet. And yeah, so Yarvin was the original person to kind of articulate the kind of doctrine of Neoreaction. In his version of it, it's more explicitly a kind of it's a post-libertarian political philosophy. One of the key slogans of it at the beginning was sort of RAGE, which was the acronym standing for Retire All Government Employees. And there was a weird kind of utopian side to it, which I think is a little bit interesting, but I don't get too caught up with this notion of patchwork, where we could privatize all functions of government and start thinking about the government as being like a kind of corporation. So really, yeah, the early Neoreaction, it's very much a kind of neoliberalism, like on steroids. Not that I'm not entirely allergic to that. I think that we are going to have to ride the tiger a little bit. There isn't really any way around that for me. But so why is it post-libertarian? It's post-libertarian in precisely insofar as we have this insight that I've said a few times, mass democracy and totalitarianism are synonyms. But this is very difficult for us to understand because we're living kind of like within a mass democratic system. And so a lot of people on the dissident right or the alt-right, they kind of criticize Yarvin nowadays, but for being, obvious or whatever. But I think that's only because a lot of the things that he was saying have become kind of old hat. But at the time that he was saying them, it was very novel and it's still very insightful. And so I would absolutely recommend that his old Unqualified Reservations writings for anyone who's interested in kind of going on a journey from, being a kind of wishy-washy leftist or liberal turn you into a hard-boiled neo-reactionary. Maybe, check that out. J.D. Vance. So I have to confess, my familiarity with Mr. Vance is not that strong. I know he wrote Hillbilly Elegy. I never read that book. I have heard him on a podcast somewhere or a YouTube channel several years back. He seems okay, but I mean, like, I don't really want to get into like the election, like dog race kind of stuff. With him, I think that the main reason he's been picked is because they're trying to disincentivize whoever was involved with that from trying to shoot Donald Trump in the head again. And basically, him as like a vice president pick is like a strong signal that like there's going to be continuity of the MAGA agenda, regardless of who's at the top of the ticket. And insofar as that's the case, I mean, I think that's fine. As neo-reactionaries, we tend to be kind of very cynical and skeptical about democracy in general. I've said a lot of things about how mass democracy and totalitarianism are synonymous, but at the same time, like we kind of live in a world where that's the game that's being played, and so if you're if you're walking into a casino and no one's at the blackjack table, you kind of have to go over to the poker table, right? Or I guess you could play blackjack with the dealer by themselves. So I'll flip that around, right? If no one's at the poker table, you got to go to the blackjack table. But anyway, yeah, Donald Trump. Donald Trump, I think, more so. I don't want to talk about his policies or like you should go vote Trump. I mean, if you want to go do that, obviously. I mean, that's like he's the only like a vital, actual populist candidate, right, on the ticket. Just because he's not a broke grad student doesn't mean he's not the man of the people. And these moments in history are rare, where the people coalesce around like a champion to help them in their struggles. And so I think that has to be taken into consideration. But from a neo-reactionary perspective, the greatest value of Trump has been the way in which he's exposed the kind of structure of the cathedral in a very kind of like obvious way. And because like without Trump,
yeah, I agree.
Yeah, no. If you think back to like 2014, for those of us who can kind of remember that, God, by Zeus, it was so depressing to turn on the radio and hear NPR talking about how we were going to be able to pick between Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton, right? And there you can see the propaganda, the predictive programming, right? Like even before the primaries began, they're telling you who's going to be the people. And Donald Trump comes out and he starts saying all this wild stuff. And it's stuff that's very heretical, right, to this progressive kind of religion of the ruling class. But he also is coming out there and he's not just being a bombastic kind of contrarian to hurt people's feelings. He's saying, look, these people who are, running the country, they're corrupt, but they're also stupid and they don't know what they're doing. And they've like caused a lot of harm to people. Why can't we just, undo some of that? Why can't we undo NAFTA? Why can't we stop having like a global race to the bottom where everyone has to compete for jobs with all 9 billion people on the planet? Or is it 9 billion now? Right? And like Donald Trump saying all those things was very powerful, but it also, I think, was a kind of teaching moment for us insofar as it forced, the kind of elements of the cathedral to really kind of come out from behind like the shadows and explicitly try to use their power to say like, no, you're not allowed to think this, you have to think that. Right. And they've done this in a very kind of hardcore way in trying to crack down on Trump. And I don't want to go too much more into that because I understand you have a YouTube channel. And if you talk too much about these kind of censorship policies or whatever, that's a little bit. Right. I don't know what's in bounds or out of bounds as far as that kind of thing is concerned, but my understanding is that YouTube it's not as liberal as places like Rumble or can you even mention competitors to YouTube on YouTube? I don't.
Yeah, you can.
Okay, yeah, but so like the moderators, like please, like don't take anything I say out on this innocent gentleman. But yeah, anyway, that's kind of my 2 cents on Trump in the context of this conversation. And then yeah, Nick Land. Nick Land, he is a philosopher who he's an English philosopher, but he was in the continental persuasion. If any of you are big like philosophy people, you'll know about the analytic continental divide in philosophy. In particular, he was a follower of Deleuze. He's a very doctrinaire. He's still a very doctrinaire Deleuzian. But his philosophical transformation has been somewhat interesting to observe. At the beginning, he was almost kind of like with Deleuze, they're kind of, and Guattari in particular, they're kind of trying to synthesize not Marx and Freud as the sort of critical theorists of the late 60s were fixated on, but they brought together Marx and Nietzsche. And they were also keenly interested in not just analyzing like capitalism, but also bringing in these insights from science, from understandings of thermodynamics, cybernetics, maybe even general systems theory. Their main idea, if you could condense it, even although I can hear the Deleuzians like screaming internally, it's that thought lags behind nature, and what they, anyways, without getting too into the weeds of postmodernism with land. So Deleuze and Guattari, they're trying to look at all this stuff scientifically, and there's some borrowing from Marx as far as that goes. But they're very like fatalistic about capitalism. There's this notion of like desire maybe being like revolutionary. That's a question that they pursue. In Land, in his early phase, he was very left wing, very radical on the left side of things. He was also, in addition to Deleuze and Guattari, he was also very influenced by a late 60s French Marxist thinker who doesn't really have I don't believe he's been translated into English outside of the Wikipedia article on him. Have you ever heard of Michel Closcard?
No.
So Closcard was also a formative influence on Land. He wrote a book called Being and Code, which is very interesting. But already in Closcard, there's his analysis. He was beginning to kind of describe the transition to a neoliberal society, but already in the 1960s, the word neoliberalism had not been coined yet, and so he called it libertarian liberalism. But anyways, so for some followers of Closcard, not just Nick Land, made like the turn from kind of left-wing internationalist Marxism to seeing that actually the nation state would be like the source of negativity against this like out of control global international capitalist system. There are these are mainly like French followers of Closcard, but Nick Land also makes the transition from the left to the right. His neo-reactionary work, you can find a lot of it on the Xenosystems blog, which I believe Passage Press is trying to make a print edition of some of that stuff. Nick Land, he goes into much darker territory than Moldbug. If you're looking for something that's got like a bit more bite, you can maybe go to him. But anyways, no. So Nick Land, he's a very serious kind of materialist thinker in kind of old Marxian sense. He's a founding figure of what's known as kind of accelerationism, which is like not this stupid idea that you just make things like worse, so that like people like rise up and then they get better. Although Marx subscribed, I think, to something a little bit like this like naive notion of accelerationism. But the basic idea of accelerationism is that it's almost kind of like a singularity theory. It's that we're in a kind of positive feedback loop, and capital is just going to run away and begin evolving so fast that it'll escape all human decision and control, and we're just going to be like subject to these like forces of like chaos and meltdown, right? To quote from, or I'm paraphrasing, meltdown has a place for you as a stimmed out transsexual Chinko Latino, whatever the phrase is. You just iced a cop with a cinematic 9mm, right? These are like quotes from like the leftist Nick Land, right? but Nick Land has since become like an extremely like reactionary right wing thinker. He does actually the most concise philosophical. I'm sorry, this is not as quick as I hoped. I know you told me to make it quick, but probably the most concise introduction to Neoreaction remains, besides my blog post, which is much more concise, but remains probably Nick Land's The Dark Enlightenment, which you can find online, which was written all the way back in 2012. And then so you're free to read that for yourself and see. One of the things I think it's important to judge a philosopher on is not necessarily whether we morally vibe with them or we're morally in agreement, but for today's age, it's how did their like predictions like hold up? Like if they're the kind of person who's making predictions, and you can go and you can look at that, and you can see whether you think those hold up or not. But even in this sense, I think Marx has to have sort of some credit. If you go back and you look at texts like the 1844 manuscripts, like some of it kind of predicts like where we headed fairly accurately. His characterization of the early stages of communism, it sounds like the Uberization, right, of the economy almost. It's if you go back and you read those now. A point against Marx's point is that it's all that stuff happened, and then we still don't have communism, right? It's still very capitalist. But anyways, So I don't know. That's kind of my quick spiel on all those four guys.
Okay, cool. All right, let's end it there, and I'll let you have the final word, maybe summing up anything you left out that you want people to know about neo-reaction, or maybe any final critiques of why you think Marxism has it wrong and why neo-reaction is the way out.
Yeah, I'm very sorry. I didn't mean to take up that. I told you to interrupt me before. Did you have something else you wanted to go to real quick?
No. I mean we covered all the main things. There was a couple.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, what were some of the secondary things? I'm curious.
I was going to ask you about why nature is good. What good and bad mean. I was going to ask about your take on globalization and why why localism is kind of your solution. And then just mention some stuff about kind of the general neo-reactionary position on things like chattel slavery, South Africa, IQ and race science, all that kind of stuff. But that's all kind of.
Oh dear.
Yeah. But
we left quite a lot on the table. Maybe some other time. Although I mean, who has time for all my rambling? Just kidding.
Right.
Okay. Anyways, but so,
what do you want the takeaway for if there's any major thing that people missed in this conversation today to learn about, like what you guys believe and why our side is why Marxists are perhaps confused.
Yeah. So that if there's one thing I would say to a Marxist, it's that this idea that we're going to like raise the class consciousness of like everyone, and there's going to be this like dramatic egalitarian like revolution. I don't think that this is the way things work. Marx's original kind of like idea of critique was that this would be something that eventually impacted the entire world. Eventually everyone would become disenchanted and disillusioned with the ideology that keeps us enthralled to whatever the power structures in society are, and then they would want to throw their chains off like after this point. I don't believe that this is possible and that this is the case. I think that what we've seen over the last few centuries, and I would say one of the good things about Marxism is that it's if you treat it as a kind of postmodern intellectual discipline, and I think these postmodern intellectual disciplines are important. That uh, you always have to look at things, like relative to what the historical conditions, on the ground are, and you have to stay learning. You have to learn from history in like a serious way. If you want to be approaching history scientifically, if you want to intervene in history in a serious manner. But I think it turns out that this notion that like, if things just become clear enough, everyone's going to rise up and want to throw off their chains. I just don't know. I don't believe that human society works that way. I think as human beings, we don't naturally all want to like participate in some proceduralist direct democracy where we're all like bothering each other about how to keep the water and the electricity on and this and that or
Hmm.
all the time. I don't think we just naturally want to do that. Life is better when we're not being bothered constantly with like all of like the nitty gritty business of the state or even just like what we do for a living, right? Division of labor is good. It's natural, it's healthy, and but along with that also comes some class stratification. And just because we have like a bad situation with respect to how our classes work today doesn't mean that like class in and of itself has to be a bad thing, and it doesn't mean that inequality in itself is necessarily a bad thing. Just because right now we have like a negative version of it, there's also a good version. But there is no good version of equality.
Okay, interesting.
The only truly democratic equal institution is death.
I would just finish
When we
by
die, it's all the same.
I would just finish by
Sorry.
saying, Marxists, classical Marxists anyway, don't really think the world works quite that way either. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that maybe that's for another discussion. But thank you for joining me today. It's been good. Now I have a better idea, and maybe some of my fellow leftists have a better idea of what you guys really believe and stand for, and yeah, we can use this greater understanding to debate and perhaps agree in the future as well. So thanks for coming
Yeah,
on.
yeah. Thank you very much for having me on. Thank you for tolerating my sometimes long-winded um, answers. And no, this has been great. Hopefully, we can get this Red Baron Alliance off the ground and make some great things happen.
Not sure about that, but maybe.
I'm,
Okay.
I'm joking, of course. I'm joking.
All right.
But no, yeah, it's been a very friendly, nice discussion. Yeah, thank you.
All right. I'm stopping recording now.